And we're live. I have no idea if that's true or not, but I'm going to define it as true. It is Monday, December 4th, 5:05 p.m. You're watching Dog Shirt TV, probably on Zoom, since the YouTube stream does not seem to be working. And I'm going to get Yascha talking. And while he starts talking, I'm just going to work on that live stream. In the meantime, we are here to discuss.
I'm going to slow walk all my interesting points so people
yes,
can
you
catch up.
You just want to defer them, be boring at the beginning. You know,
always what I aim for.
Do all the most offensive stuff while the audience is contained. Yascha's book is The Identity Trap, and I want to start with the big question that I'm sure no one's asked you yet, Yascha. When did you sign up to be a surrogate for Ron DeSantis?
I never have, no will.
All right, so let's take that as a joking jumping off point and say a lot of people who look glibly at the thesis of this book will say, oh, another white guy of a certain age demographic who likes the liberalism, the lefty politics of his generation, but doesn't like the lefty politics of the generation that comes after him. And so he's signed up with the anti-woke league. How are they wrong as regards your book?
Well, first of all, I think that if you have been conscious over the last decades, you have noticed that there really is a new political ideology that has changed what much of the left is like, that many universalist commitments that help to define what it is to be on the left have been challenged and in some cases simply gone out of a window in the last decades. And so what my book actually tries to do is to chronicle the nature, the history of these ideas and how they became influential over the last decades, and to provide a serious critique of these ideas. And I think that while there are many critics of quote-unquote wokeness who operate in bad faith on the right, there are also very serious ways in which some of the ideas and some of the social practices that this ideology have inspired over the last years have proven to be very counterproductive. And in fact, as somebody who has been worried about the rise of populism, about people like Donald Trump for a very long time, as somebody who's a democracy crisis hipster, who's been arguing about the threat that populists pose to democracy since before it was cool, I'm also very concerned that this set of ideas actually helps to explain how people like Donald Trump continue to be competitive in our politics, why so many people don't have much trust in our institutions.
So help me out. Actually, I don't really need help on this because, as you know, I'm quite sympathetic to the thesis of this book. But a reasonable person looking at this from a sympathy with, I would say, sort of left identity politics, will say, Yascha professes sympathy with a whole lot of the goals, a whole lot of the causes, but he kind of doesn't want anything to go too far. And it seems to me you are actually arguing something else, which is that you're not sympathetic to the goals and the causes. And in fact, you actually do the work to go back and look at the roots of some of these ideas and where they come from, and kind of make the argument in a very gentle way that some of them are pretty rotten from the beginning. And so I guess I want to get you to talk a little bit about how much of this is an intellectual history of what most people call wokeness and what you call the identity synthesis, and how much of it, I mean, it's got a lot of intellectual history of it, but it's also got a lot of what we in college used to call, we didn't call it woke, we called it PC. And, you know, there's always been a just kind of the tired liberal frustrated with the people who are, you know, in one generation communists, in the next generation new left activists, in the next generation it was us and the identity politics people, and now for you it's the woke mob. How much of this is just, you know, is really an intellectual history, and how much is it just every generation faces this same problem, and the task of liberalism is kind of not getting too exhausted?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I think that there have been many illiberal left movements, and the task of standing up to those movements has always been important, particularly to people who are on the liberal left or who are on the democratic left. You know, when you look at the founding of a magazine like Dissent as democratic socialists, today some people like to use that term as though it was self-evident that by being socialist you're democratic, or if you're a true Democrat you must be a socialist. To the founders of that magazine, democratic socialism meant standing up to the Stalinist socialism, the illiberal socialism that was very, very popular in intellectual circles at the time. And so that was a genuine commitment, right? Students at my high school in Munich, decades before I was there in the 1960s, marched down the main street of Munich shouting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, Lenin. So I think, you know, you're certainly right that part of what it is to stand for the liberal left has always been to be able to recognize that there are elements of the left that are not liberal and that must be opposed because they are capable of doing genuine damage, and they in many cases have done genuine damage. So I think, you know, that I agree with. I do think, though, that part of this political movement is different ideologically from those previous movements. You can say it's the new incarnation of what sort of a center of gravity of the illiberal left is in 2023, and I think they'll be right in certain kinds of ways. But just as it was important to understand and argue against the shortcomings of Maoism or the shortcomings of Stalinism in the 50s and 60s, I think it's important to argue against the shortcomings of an illiberal form of identity politics today. And so that's the second point, which is I have no problem. I don't talk about the woke mob, by the way, in the book, to be very clear. I know you're being hyperbolic, but I don't use that language, and I would not use that language. I understand that there's genuine concerns about injustices based on identity that are well taken, and but obviously our countries have been deeply shaped by historical injustice and remain unjust in significant ways today. But I think one of the reasons why I do indeed think that this ideology is a matter not of going too far in the right direction, but of going very much in the wrong direction, is that it's actually a rejection of the mainstream movements that fought against those injustices in the past. And one of the things to understand about critical race theory, for example, is that its founders explicitly set themselves against the mainstream African-American tradition of political thought in the United States and against things like the civil rights movement. For Derek Bell, the founder of critical race theory, he argued, for example, that we need to get rid of what he calls the defunct racial equality ideology of the civil rights movement. So we are here dealing with an ideology that I think is new in important respects, even though it may be a new iteration of an illiberal left, and that is very radical insofar as it rejects things like the core tenets of the civil rights movement, explicitly so since its founding. So one thing that makes this moment different is that for the first time, at least in a very long time, that illiberal left movement is in charge in many American institutions in a way that it has not been in previous junctures.
So one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of months is a kind of working test case of this theory, which is the reaction in liberal and left circles to the October 7th massacre in Israel and to the subsequent Israeli reaction. And I think you see in the kind of reaction of a lot of campuses and a lot of left groups, and then the appalled counter reaction by liberal groups, a kind of clash of these two, of the sort of identitarian left, or as you would call it, the identity synthesis advocates, and more conventional liberals or conventional liberals. And so I want to ask whether, first of all, you agree that this is a kind of very vivid illustration of the difference in worldview, and secondly, how you would describe the clash.
Yes, I think so. And obviously, the conflict in the Middle East as a whole is very complicated, and we should have deep empathy for all of the civilian victims of this conflict. It's perfectly legitimate to protest for the rights of Palestinians. When you look at some of the reaction on the left after October 7th, however, I do think that it's been quite shocking when you see a chapter of Black Lives Matter in Chicago call for protest before Israel had started to respond to this attack in any serious way, that featured paragliders or parachuters, in a seeming allusion to the parachuters who landed at the music festival in southern Israel and killed over 150 people at that rave. When you see professors at Columbia University sign a statement of solidarity that not only neglects to mention the Israeli hostages, but describes that terror attack as military action. When you see similar kind
Actually,
of...
it was worse than that. They described the terrorist attack as the Palestinian counteroffensive, or at least the most recent statement did.
wow. Yeah, perhaps that is, yeah. I mean, so, so it's
there may have been more than one.
Right. So when on that kind of area of complete denial of that awful terror attack, the worst killing of Jewish civilians since World War II, you really have to try and understand what's going on. And I do think that the ideology that I described in the book has something to do with that. This is the result of looking at the world by saying you can understand it by dividing whites versus people of color, colonizers versus colonized, by having an exclusively structural interpretation of racism, in which racism is no longer having first personal beliefs, like I think members of that group are somehow bad and therefore I'm a racist. It is merely or predominantly, you are a member of a marginalized group and thereby you suffer structural racism. And there's no such thing as being racist against the dominant group, as many people have come to believe. And then you impose that on Israel-Palestine and say, well, Israelis are white, the settler colonialists, and therefore any form of resistance to them is just a counter-offensive. It's just a form of resistance. And of course, this has nothing to do with a much more complicated reality on the ground, in which, for example, a plurality of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi, who have fled Middle Eastern countries since 1948, mostly, been thrown out of places like Iraq and Iran and Morocco and Syria and elsewhere, are not ethnically in any obvious way distinct from Palestinians. They're not on average any more dark-skinned than, or light-skinned, than Palestinians. And they had nowhere else to go. So the idea that these are sort of white colonizers and that the resistance by the people of color, no matter how brutal, is simply a legitimate form of resistance is truly distasteful. But that view is what has driven all of those letters by artists and writers and so on. And it is deeply rooted, as I show in the book, in the kind of basic conceptual categories of the identity synthesis.
All right, so I want to spend the body of this conversation talking about the intellectual roots of this, because I actually think, that's, from my point of view, the most interesting part of the book is actually where the ideas come from. I found some of it quite surprising, and a lot of it very intuitive, and so I think people will have their own opinions about, what's going on campuses. I hate it. What's cultural appropriation? I personally love cultural appropriation. I think music is incomprehensible without it. We have a music historian in the audience. I would invite Richard's sense of whether there is such a thing as music without cultural appropriation. Leave all that aside. I don't actually want to get into the culture war aspects of it, but I think the history of it is really interesting. And so one of the theses that you advance is that basically the synthesis is kind of Edward Said working with Foucault, working with ideas of Foucault. And so I just want to pose the question, how much of this is really Foucault on steroids from Said and everything else flows from that?
Yeah, so, one of the things that I'm struck by is that I do think we're dealing with a generally new political ideology, and yet there's virtually no serious discussion of the intellectual history of these ideas. There's a few kind of mostly right-wing polemicists who've written about it. There's, so far as I know, nobody in academia who's offered an intellectual history of these ideas, which is quite remarkable. So what people like Chris Rufo and so on say is that this is a form of cultural Marxism, that the way to understand this ideology is basically to take Marxism, take out cultural, economic categories like social class and so on, put in cultural categories like race and gender and sexual orientation, and boom, you have quote-unquote wokeness. That is wrong substantively. I think saying that you can take economic class, economic categories like social class out of Marxism and be left with a lot is a little bit like saying you take the bat out of baseball. That's just not very much left. And it's also wrong as a matter of intellectual history, as it turns out. So I trace this set of ideas back to Michel Foucault, who was influential in a number of ways. He rejected grand narratives like Marxism, but also like liberalism, also like the basic principles of our democratic political system. He became very skeptical of claims to a form of neutral truth, or to the idea that societies in his day had really made progress in how they treat criminals, the mentally ill, sexual minorities. He thought that the main locus of power, of political power, was not a top-down hierarchical exercise of power in which, the state passes, the Congress passes a law and bureaucrats and the police force enforce it and so on, but rather that sort of this conversation is an exercise of power because it really inheres in political discourses and the way we frame the world and think about it. And as a result, he became quite skeptical about the possibility of political progress because he thought that any set of discourses or any discourse would end up being about as constraining, about as oppressive as the other. So the most we can do is to resist this discourse, which will lead us to a moment of freedom, to a moment of sort of a space to act, but very quickly a new set of discourses is going to prove just as constraining. And so there's a set of
he described how his own would come to be very constraining.
Yes, interestingly, and I think he himself would be repelled by much of the ideology that he gave rise to. That's one of the ironies that I trace in the first part of the book. And so that turned out to be very influential. And one set of thinkers that was really attracted to these ideas, at the same time try to put the politics back into it. And that was particularly true of post-colonial thinkers. And it makes sense in the context, right? They had to think through how to lead newly independent nations. They wanted to reject the kind of Western ideologies that had shaped those nations in the period of colonialism, and that had often provided justifications for colonialism. And liberals are often singled out for blame here, in part because some liberals, by no means all liberals, did provide justifications for colonialism. But Marxists also did. Karl Marx's justification for colonialism in India was oddly very similar, ran in parallel to John Stuart Mill's justification of colonialism in India. And so people like Said and Gayatri Spivak, an Indian literary theorist, were really attracted to postmodernism and poststructuralism because these ideologies promised that they would explain to us how we can reject those long-standing ideologies. They were a kind of universal solvent. And at the same time, they needed to figure out how the country should now rule themselves. What kind of institutions should they have? What kind of laws should they have? What kind of ideas should govern them? And so they set out to make this ideology more useful for straightforward political action. The first step here was Edward Said in Orientalism, as you implied. What Said said is that the West's construction of the East, of the Orient, in quotation marks, is a lot of what justified colonial rule. But the point was not just, as Mr. Foucault's notion of a discourse might have implied, Said says, to explain what's happened. It is to redistribute political power, to use this more politicized form of discourse critique in order to put power in the hands of the oppressed. And here you get one of the first themes of contemporary social justice politics, which is this kind of form of discourse critique as a way of making supposedly political progress. And you see it in a lot of our politics today. It sort of feels natural to us that one way to have feminist politics today might not just be to ask for a particular kind of law to be on the books, to be passed by Congress or parliaments, but to celebrate or critique or render problematic the Barbie movie. But this is one kind of form of politics today, is quite obvious, and that's rooted in this post-colonial reaction to the postmodern project.
So how does it go from that to becoming hyper-personal? Edward Said was a flamboyant character. He was a combative intellectual, but he was quite genteel. He was not personally censorious about sort of wagging his fingers at people and saying that they're he wasn't part of what's become a call-out culture, right? He was a stuffy intellectual type. And somehow this morphs into a kind of sense that the personal thing that you just said warrants a kind of humiliation in response, and a kind of call out as very kind of Maoist framework. And I'm wondering, one thing you don't go into in the book is where that really personal is political aspect of it's a part of the synthesis, right? And if you're not with me, I will I will picket your falafel stand.
Yeah, so I think there's a few more steps in the intellectual story that help to explain that a little bit. But then that really is answered by how these ideas become popularized, and I think in some ways vulgarized. So just to give at least one more step in the intellectual story, Spivak is this other post-colonial thinker who is really grappling with a kind of semi-rejection of identity categories in postmodern thought, right? Michel Foucault, in our terminology, is a gay man. He's the man who has sex with men. He doesn't like that label for homosexual in particular. He thinks it's too constraining of a variety of sexual experiences. And he and Gilles Deleuze have this interesting exchange where they say, you know, Marxists always wanted to speak on behalf of proletariat. Well, it's time for intellectuals to no longer speak on behalf of other people. You know, the workers of Paris can speak for themselves. And Spivak is quite shocked by this. She's herself a translator of Derrida. She brings out the first edition of his work. She writes an introduction of over 100 pages to it. But she's really disturbed by this because she says the subaltern in the third world, people in the streets of Kolkata, they can't speak for themselves. They don't have the political resources, the material resources. Somebody needs to speak for them. And so she grapples with the fact that she buys the kind of postmodernist, post-structuralist rejection of identity categories. But she nevertheless feels that somebody needs to be able to speak on identity, on behalf of identity categories, and that requires those categories. So she comes up with this kind of slightly
more. I mean, this aspect actually partakes a bit of cultural Marxism, insofar as she's kind of reasserting the idea that there needs to be a vanguard of. I mean, it's not the party, but it's the intellectual who's going to exercise a kind of dictatorship of the masses of the street people of Calcutta, right?
Yes, and it's not about economic categories, it's in different ways. But yes, I think there is a sense of consciousness raising, right? And she says, look, what we need is strategic essentialism. Even if philosophically speaking, these essentialist notions of identity are wrong, for strategic political purposes, we have to act as though they're right. And that sounds a little incoherent. She admits that. She said, my search is not one for coherence. But we need to encourage people to lean into their identities. And that explains a lot of, again, how our politics works today. Why, if you go to an activist space, people say, well, race is, of course, a social construct, broadly agree with, and then go on to say,
embrace your whiteness.
But we need to, you know, center Black and brown people, or, you know, we have to do what BIPOC demand, right? And so on. So that, I think, is an interesting transformation, and that helps to explain a little bit of what you're talking about, because I think what happens then is that as this theory later becomes popularized in social media, a lot of people start to define themselves by their identities. They're saying, what I am is a function of the intersection of identities at which I stand. And that naturally leads to certain kinds of political demands. And if you're undermining those demands, or if you disagree with those demands, you're really attacking my identity group. A political disagreement with me comes to be interpreted as an attack on the identity group, on, you know, whose demands, you know, whose interests that demand is supposed to wholly encapsulate and summarize. And that's, I think, where it becomes easy to cast it as this sort of unacceptable transgression. Just one more thought is that you said that Said himself was rather more genteel and thoughtful, and Spivak herself was too. I mean, there's really a kind of theme here where the people whose ideas help to shape this ideology come to rue that. You know, Said, since we've been talking about him for a little bit, let me quote this. He said, you know, identity is as boring a subject as one can imagine. For he certainly is worried about the way in which people have been victimized on the basis of their identity. He says, victimhood, alas, does not guarantee or necessarily enable an enhanced sense of humanity. Marginality and homelessness are not to be gloried in. They're to be brought to an end so that more and not fewer people can enjoy the benefits of what has for centuries been denied to the victims of race, class, and gender. And in a similar way, you know, Spivak, in reference to the tea-wallahs, chai-wallahs who sell tea in the streets of India, refers to the humorlessness of the identity wallahs at American universities. So these figures come to be quite skeptical of the influence of their ideas, often explicitly so, even as they come to be taken up and institutionalized in the firmament more broadly.
Before we go on, Richard, you have a question or a comment? But you got to unmute yourself.
There we are. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Hello. So I wanted to say, Yascha, that I extremely sympathetic to the book, and I'm glad that there's another thing out there addressing this. I also have to commend you for your courage, because I know that in certainly in an academic setting, it's not to speak about this. This is it's not easy, and so you know, my moral support there. I did feel, however, some in the book that I felt like I was seeing a marksman work who's very good, but had been handed a weapon with a defective scope. And I felt like, in some respects, some of your arguments I felt missed the mark. I felt like you'd kind of nibbled around some of the edges of it. I guess one of the things that stuck out for me, for example, is that I felt like, although in your discussions of Adolph Reed's work, you took on some of the economic sides of it, I felt like the cultural, what we've called the cultural turn, was kind of only far back in the background. The fact that this idea of reducing everything to culture had kind of hijacked what has a lot of the discussions that we've been having in the academy since certainly since the 80s, and to the point that and of course, as we've seen with Adolph Reed and others like him, and also with a number of figures in the Frankfurt School, that those sorts of arguments that don't take culture to be fundamental don't seem to be, they don't even get a hearing much. And so I'm just wondering your own thoughts, your own perspective on where culture fits into this, if I'm misreading your book, or what's going on.
Yeah, so I guess is the question about where, sort of how important economic categories of analyses are versus how important cultural
relative to culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my objection, my point is not that we should completely base ourselves on one or the other, right? So I find it striking that in the United States, many of my colleagues in the social sciences will publish studies in which they ascribe something to race by running a multivariate analysis, but they don't have a class variable. And in a country in which, of course, it is true, for example, that more African Americans are working class than white Americans in proportional terms, for the more white working class Americans than black working class Americans in absolute numbers, that's simply going to mislead you, right? If you just look at race without looking at class, you are going to ascribe to race some things that are actually a matter of social class. Now, conversely, in France, many social scientists run studies in which they look at social class and they don't look at race. And they're going to ascribe certain causal phenomena to class when they are at least partially due to race. So clearly the answer is that we have to look at a little bit of both. When I offer a kind of rational reconstruction of this new ideology in the fourth part of the book, I say that it consists in three main claims. One, that the prime prism, the principal way to understand the world is to look at race, gender, sexual orientation, and other kinds of identity markers. Secondly, that universal values and neutral rules are just a way of pulling the wool over people's eyes and perpetuating existing forms of racism and sexism, which is why we've not made any progress on those. And thirdly, therefore, we have to throw those on the ash heap of history and make how we treat each other and how this treats all of us explicitly depend on the kind of identity groups to which we belong. Now, forget the second and third part of this for the moment. On the first one, my answer is that, yes, of course, race, gender, and sexual orientation and our identity categories matter for understanding the world. That is certainly one of the things we should look at, but they're not the only one we should look at. If we only look at the world in terms of those things, we're going to badly misconstrue it. We should look at social class as well. We should look at patriotism and nationalism as a motive force of human history. We should look at religion as a very important factor in history. We should look at individual actions and aspirations and idiosyncrasies as explaining a lot of how the social world works. We need, instead of coming to the social world with a maniacal assumption about how to read it, to go into each situation with those different possible lenses in our mind and try them on and see which combination of those actually can help to explain a particular kind of situation. So I guess the answer I would give is, I think when you have a worldview, as many of my students now do, that looks at everything for identity categories, you're going to neglect the very important dimension of economics. But I would have the same criticism of Marxist theorists who want to look at everything through the lens of economic class, when I think other things, including identity categories, also matter. What we should reject is a monomaniacal methodological approach that thinks that by some theoretical commitment, we can always know in advance what matters in a particular situation.
All right, so I want to go back to your point that some of the theoreticians of this have had second thoughts. I was witness, I got to be careful how I talk about it because we were under Chatham House rules, but I was witness to a confrontation between you and somebody who was named in the book, not a quite friendly one, in which somebody you discuss in the book heard you present on this, and you guys had a very interesting interchange before an audience about it. I'm curious whether you've heard from any of the theoreticians, some of whom are still alive, whose work you discuss, and sometimes you critique, but you deal with their work quite in an engaged way and quite respectfully of the ideas that they're advancing, and in some cases point out that their work is more complicated than the characterizations of it or than the implementations of it. Derek Bell is no longer with us, but some of the others are. Have you heard from any of them in response to the book? And if so, what was their reaction?
No, I haven't directly. I mean, when I think of sort of the main figures that I write about in the first part of the book, I guess there's 5 or 6, Michel Foucault and Jean-Luc Lyotard, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, Derek Bell, and Kimberly Crenshaw. The only 2 of those who are alive are Gayatri Spivak, who continues to teach at Columbia University, I believe well into her 80s, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And I haven't had any kind of direct exchange or meeting with either of them. It'd be very interesting too. There are people who I've argued with in different parts of the book who I've had conversations with. When you look at the chapter, for example, on cultural appropriation, and why, like you, Ben, I think that mutual cultural influence in a deeply diverse society is something we should celebrate rather than worry about. I've had a really interesting and I think quite friendly, spirited, but very friendly debate on NPR's Room to Debate about cultural appropriation with one of the main theorists who have tried to make sense from a philosophically rigorous perspective as to what's the worry here and why it should be a serious worry. That's T. Christopher Nguyen, very, very, very good young philosopher. So that perhaps is the closest I've come to having that exchange with somebody whose ideas I've really discussed in the book. I mean, this is part, of course, and I don't want to put this in particular on Spivak, who's in her 80s and has other things to do, on Kimberly Crenshaw, who strikes me as somebody who's open to serious conversation, if I don't personally know her, but of a broader culture where there's not much exchange on these ideas,
Right.
that where many of the critics of these ideas have had open calls to say, I'm happy to debate anybody on my critiques of these ideas, and they've never been taken up. Really serious people who are in good faith. And I'm struck by the fact that this is quite different when I go to France, in part because those ideas, I think, are less in the ascendant. They don't own public discourse in the same way. And so there's a woman in France called Rokhaya Diallo. She used to write a little bit, a sort of global opinion column for the Washington Post. So some people may know her from that. And she's sort of known as sort of the most woke person in France or something like that. She's sort of the most visible woke media presence in France in a certain kind of way. And we met at a conference in France and had a spirited debate. And we've since had a number of occasions to have public debates in France and have become sort of friends as a result. And I'm just struck by the fact that sort of whoever you might think is her equivalent in the United States would not have engaged in similar public debates. And there is, I think, something wrong both with some of the ideology that leads people to think that if you disagree with these ideas, you must be a bad person or you must be insincere. I do think that there's elements in the popularized version of this ideology that lead to that, but it's also connected to some of the specificities of American public discourse and the power that these ideas have come to have very, very quickly, where people feel like they don't have to debate. Somebody like Rokhaya has to debate to make her point of view heard, but as a result, I think her arguments are actually rather more subtle, and she's much more impressive than some of her American equivalent figures.
And so when you talk about the translation of this into an enforced regime, and I mean regime in the top to bottom sense, right? It has elements that are enforced as policy. It has elements that are enforced as norm. It has all kinds of layers, including just the basic social expectation layer. You ascribe a huge percentage of it to social media and to Tumblr in particular. And as the parent of somebody who was part of that Tumblr world, and I do think the cultural influence of Tumblr is really understated, under discussed, and so talk about the process of, something going from the level of Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and Roberti Spivak to something that, is a part of the personnel policies of 1,000 different corporations, and, is, something that the CDC takes into account when it decides who gets vaccines and in what order. How does that happen? It happens really fast.
Yeah, so far we've sort of been, so the book has 4 parts. We're not going to talk about all of them today, but just to give people a sort of taste. The first part is an intellectual history, which is sort of what we've been talking about so far. The second part then asks, well, how do those ideas actually go from being cloistered in university to being influential in society as a whole? I mean, the third part offers a critique of the main applications of these ideas to areas like cultural appropriation, free speech, the new forms of separatism in a lot of progressive educational institutions, race-sensitive public policy, and so on. And the fourth part, I alluded to it a little bit, really offers a sort of a rational reconstruction of this ideology, as well as a liberal response to it in the case for liberalism more broadly. So speaking to the second part, to how do these ideas come to be so influential? By the way, Kimberly Crenshaw in 2011 publishes a paper celebrating the 20th anniversary of critical race theory. And she says, look, we've come to have a lot of influence in the academy, and it's lovely, it's a success story, it's great, but we're not going to have any influence in society as a whole. This guy Barack Obama just got elected. And again, this is an indication of how radical these ideas are. His political philosophy is fundamentally at odds with the key tenets of critical race theory. He seems to be pretty popular. We're not going to have any influence in mainstream society. It's a pretty pessimistic, from her point of view, paper. Well, 10 years later, the ideology is incredibly influential. And Kimberly Crenshaw has come to be a household name virtually. A household name is perhaps exaggerated, but certainly somebody who's known very broadly in activist circles and political circles and some intellectual circles, right? How does that happen? Well, part of it is a short march through the institutions. Part of it is that, as we have learned, university campuses really embrace those ideas, and many university departments embrace those ideas, but so increasingly do administrators who are really influential in those places. And so students who graduate, especially from those top universities, go into the workforce and bring those ideas with them. Part of this is a story about Donald Trump's victory and the way that screws up the country in all kinds of ways, but also screws up the kind of critical bones on the left, makes it very hard to criticize bad ideas on the left without being accused of somehow running interference for Donald Trump, right? But part of it really is this organic social media story. And Tumblr stands very much at the origin of that. Tumblr was the first platform in which people could really assemble by finding a kind of hashtag, effectively, that describes them, in which they could self-assemble by topic tags. That was a sort of technological, or I guess conceptual, innovation at the time. And what these mostly teenage users of Tumblr ended up doing was to proliferate the ways in which they might be able to self-define. It is where a lot of new gender categories were invented, but a lot of other kinds of forms of political self-identification as well. And I think it blew out of the water sort of basic constraints on identity formation that you have in the analog world. To have an identity that's shared with others, you need to have a minimum number of people. And most people want that to be people they can communicate with in a direct way. So in an analog world, if you want 10 people who share your identity group and there's 1,000 kids in your school, that means it has to be an identity that at least 1% of people are going to share. That makes it hard to get a lot of new identities off the ground. So you end up with a 90s high school movie, right? With the geeks and the jocks and the, whatever, 6 or 7 kind of groups, right? Suddenly in the world of Tumblr, you can find 10 people anywhere in the world to co-create this identity with. And so it becomes very generative, in some ways productively and positively generative, of these different identity groups. But those then need an ideology to hold them together, to figure out, if you're defined by this identity, and that's the most important thing about you, and that's how we see the world, how are you going to communicate with each other? And a kind of popularized version of this identity synthesis, in particular of ideas around intersectionality, around the idea that you have to defer to the spokespeople for other oppressed and marginalized groups, and that any one activist in good standing or Tumblr user in good standing has to sort of embrace all of the canonical interpretations of what that means for how to think about everything from environmental politics to African-American activism to Israel-Palestine. All of that starts to take off on Tumblr and then gets translated into a written form on websites like Ford Catalog, everydayfeminism.com, salon.com, and then slowly starts to enter more mainstream media outlets. It transforms what Vox looks like over the course of the 2010s. And then, of course, you have a mainstream media that at the time is in deep crisis economically because the print ad is cratering. They want viral articles. And as they see many of these first-person articles telling stories of injustice and discrimination in the jargon of a popularized identity synthesis go pretty viral, they say, well, why don't we buy in some of those writers and give them a stake? And so suddenly, within the course of 10 years, and in some ways in the course of 5 years, this ideology goes from the very margins of the internet on Tumblr to the New York Times opinion page.
And your answer, I'm being very crude about it, is double down on liberalism. And there's, you kind of, the third and fourth sections of the book basically have a kind of Reagan-esque, there's nothing wrong with liberalism that can't be fixed with what's right about liberalism. And I guess my question to you about that is, if I were skeptical of that position, which in my more despairing moments I am, I would say, look, it was the ideological inadequacies of liberalism that created a hole for these ideologies to blossom in. Why do we think that liberalism is capable of addressing the inadequacies that allow large numbers of people, particularly intellectual elites, to think that the promise of equality is a sham, and meritocracy is just cover for power, and cultural appropriation means the rich steal from the poor rather than what it really means, which is we all influence each other. What is the basis for confidence that liberalism has the tools to address this?
If we have to pick a center-right political leader that you're gonna use to characterize the third and fourth parts of the book, how about we pick Churchill rather than Reagan and say, because liberalism is a worst system of government or a worst philosophy for government, except for all of the rest. And I think whatever
we could have fun with this game. Like see which leaders we can plug liberalism into their quotes and still have it work.
Let's get a beer and
liberals will do the right thing after exhausting all other options.
Yeah, well, that too, Churchill. Actually, I think a lot of these work. Look, one case I make when I describe liberalism in its own terms in the book is, beyond explaining why it's a society we should aim to live in, one of political equality and individual freedom and collective self-determination, why that's something that is deeply appealing in itself, because it is the most principled answer to the basic problem we otherwise have in the world. But we need government, but the moment we have government, we ask ourselves who should rule. And liberalism has the best set of answers about how we can have a government that is useful to us, because it can create public goods and other things without becoming tyrannical. But it also has incredibly important empirical benefits. It is not a coincidence that when you look in the world today, all of the richest countries in the world, excepting a couple of oil-rich dictatorships of less than 5 million people, are liberal democracies until this day. The countries in the world with the highest human development index are liberal democracies. The countries in the world that people around the world say they most want to migrate to, if they had the choice to migrate anywhere they want, are liberal democracies. Our societies are phenomenally successful, and they have been able, by and large, to keep the peace with each other in a way that is not true of dictatorships with each other, or even communist regimes with each other, and so on and so forth. So there's many empirical reasons to think that liberalism is actually doing pretty damn good by comparison to the competition. And more importantly, when we think internally in our own societies, yes, there's significant injustices and problems in the United States and in other liberal democracies as well. But unlike what people like Derek Bell claim, he claimed that the American year 2000 was as racist as it was in 1950 or 1850, that racism may have become less naked, but it was as present as it ever had been. That, I think, is simply untrue. In fact, I find his statement to be offensive, not to the great Americans living today, but to those who suffered much worse forms of discrimination in the past. And how is it that we've made those forms of progress? Because of the great political movements, some of which drew on identity, but asked for inclusion in universalist political institutions that fought for progress by invoking liberal ideals. What did Frederick Douglass say in his most important speech, and what to the Negro is the 4th of July? He called out his fellow citizens on their hypocrisy for celebrating the idea that all men are created equal on a day when African Americans were still held in still held in chains. But he said the solution is not to rip up those principles, it's to live up to them. If you believe in the idea that all men are created equal, then by what right are you excluding us from the enjoyment of those institutions? And by the way, when you look at people who are arguing for gay rights, including some people like our friend Jonathan Rauch, who was among the first to argue for the idea of same-sex marriage in the pages of a major American magazine, they will tell you that the first battles they fought were against people within the movement who didn't want inclusion in universal institutions, who said, we don't want to get married, that's for terrible hetero breeders, we want to blow up bourgeois institutions, right? And people like Jonathan Rauch say, no, this is how we're going to win this fight, by saying, how is our love different from that of others? Why should we not have the same rights, the same respect as heterosexuals enjoy in this society? But what right are you excluding us from them? So I think that the invocation of those universal values and neutral rules has been a huge part of how historically we've been able to make progress. And so I don't see myself as a defender of a status quo. I want to defend elements of the status quo. But I think that liberalism has always been a progressive project, one that tries to make the world come into closer alignment with the institutions, with the values that we hold. And that work is not yet done. There's evident injustices that we have to fight against in the United States. But I think the demand for inclusion in universal values is how historically we've made progress, and it is how we're likely to continue to make progress.
So I want to close with the linkage between this book and some of your past books. Your past books have been both in the academic space and in the more popular space. I would say in the vein of both warning about democratic deconsolidation, but also about democracy protection from the illiberal forces of the right. A lot of your critics would say, okay, Yascha's both sidesing it. He's done the illiberal right is really dangerous. Now he's doing the illiberal left, particularly on campuses, is really dangerous, and they're exporting it to your schools and to your workplaces. So I guess my question, we'll close on this, is first of all, how does this relate to your past work? And secondly, how do you assess the dangers of the illiberal, progressive, whatever you want to call this, the identity synthesis world, the woke mob, versus the other forces that you talk about and that you've written about?
Yeah. So look, I think it should be possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm more worried about Donald Trump than I am about the influence that these ideas have on campus. I've written at least 2 books dealing with the threat of people like Donald Trump. When I first wrote a book about it, it was one of the first books that was dealing with populism and explaining what it is and so on. I was very early to the game, but I tend to believe in the virtue of not repeating yourself as a writer, and of talking about things that are great, breaking new ground, rather than the things that everybody is writing about. And at this point, I don't have that much new to say about populism. I've written hundreds of articles about it, hundreds of episodes of my podcast dealing with it, hundreds of talks and interviews and public speeches and so on. And there's lots and lots of great books and articles and contributions about this topic from lots of people. So I think intellectually, there's less new ground to drag to open. So yes, I'm very worried about Donald Trump winning the election in 2024. I think he may well. If you give me even odds right now, I would say that Donald Trump is going to win, and that would be terrifying. The second Trump term would be much worse than the first Trump term. Not only should we also be able to worry about some genuinely bad ideas on the left, about the way, for example, in which teachers in many elite private schools now are splitting kids as early as 8 or 7 or 6 years old up into different racial groups for part of the week, because that, I think, is going to backfire badly in terms of the kind of society that we should create. But also, fighting against one is not in any way in competition with fighting against the other. In fact, they are mutually reinforcing endeavors. Why is Trump doing so well in 2024? There's all kinds of reasons for that. But it's not that he's super popular. Most Americans deeply dislike Donald Trump. It's that they don't trust the left to run the country, that they've lost trust in a lot of our mainstream institutions, that a key new voting bloc in the Republican Party, about 10% of the Republican electorate now, is mostly young, mostly non-white, mostly pretty progressive, should really be voting for the Democratic Party, you might think, but is voting for the Republicans because they're very worried about the hold of wokeness in our political institutions. And so to me, you started off by talking about, DeSantis and so on. I think writers and journalists tend to be clever by half. We tend to think, oh, if there's a problem in the world, as long as we don't talk about it, people won't notice. People aren't idiots. And I think that I'd much rather them understand the illiberalism on the left, in my terms, that is conformable with the defense of liberal philosophical values. And it comes from the mouth of somebody who will also tell them, as I do in the book, that people like Donald Trump are a serious danger, then leave that field to the people who do actually want Trump to win, or who want to become mini Trumps of their own.
I have a disclosure that I have to end on, which is that I am a alum of the Bank Street School in New York City, which features in your book as a particularly villainous location of this ideology. And I will say that that surprised me, actually, because when I was at Bank Street, it was progressive elementary education in the best sense of the word, and I did not know it had morphed into quite the monster that you describe it. So I was saddened on behalf of my alma mater, where our idea of crazy progressive elementary school was to have a Ben Franklin printing press in the 3rd grade room, and just to see what we would do with it. And we all learned how to do printing. And I believe I was in the first class in the country to have computers. Bank Street did all kinds of cool experiments.
And I'm sure that Bank Street is still doing some good things. I don't want to,
I have no contact with it. I have no sense of what it does now. But it is apparently part of the identity synthesis, and that makes me sad as one of their few, I think, guerrilla right-wing graduates. Yascha Mounk, enemy of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're a great American. Thank you for joining us on Dogshirt TV. Apologies to those who tried to join on the YouTube channel. I will upload this video to it so that you all get to see Yascha in all his right-wing glory, and pick up the book. It's
with hype men such as you, then I don't know what friends I need.
It's Yascha Christopher Rufo Mounk. The book is The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. And we will be back next time. And I am not sure who our guest is going to be yet, because I have been doing a lot of reading to bring you these episodes, and I am no longer ahead of myself. So stay tuned on Dogshirt Daily for the announcement of the next set of shows.
Thank
See
you
you
for having
later.
me on, Ben.
Thank you for coming.